Chapter 2 First Day of School, Monday, September 6, 1859. 6-year-old William Perry sat on his favorite tree branch of the old oak tree in his front yard. He would sit on this branch whenever he wanted time alone to think. Today he was daydreaming about traveling around the world meeting all kinds of interesting people. Just then his brother young Jim came outside and began to yell, "Hey, Will! Mama said to come down from that tree branch and eat your breakfast so you can go to your first day of school with a full stomach." Will reluctantly climbed down. He would rather stay there all day than go to some stupid old school, although he had to admit he couldn't wait to see his best friend, little Carl Baker, who was 12 and exactly twice Will's age. Will also liked the teacher, Mrs. Kerr, because she always gave him treats when he went to her general store. The other kids told him she also teaches you a lot of things like how to read, write, and to subtract, and even about children and animals in faraway lands. Above the door of the Perry log cabin, Will's father had nailed a horseshoe for good luck. Every time Will would go in the house, he would jump up and try to touch it. He wasn't quite tall enough yet, but he always had fun trying. Today, when he jumped up, he touched the top of the door. He couldn't believe it. This was the closest he'd ever come. Will began whistling as he went into the house and ran up and kissed his mother on the cheek. "Hello, honey," Kazar said. "Good morning, Mama." "Sit down and eat your pancakes. Today is a big day for you, your first day of school. My, I can't believe how my baby has grown." "I'm not a baby," Will protested. "I'm 6, and Daddy said this Saturday I get to drive the horses when we go to market. Since Brother Joseph has left home to look for a job in the city of Ypsilanti, Michigan, Daddy says he needs me." Will then asked his mother, "Hey, Mama, can I go to Fred and Margaret's after school today and see my niece and nephew?" "Just for a couple hours. Margaret has enough to handle over there without you being in the way. Jim, will you take your little brother to your sister's for a while and then bring him home later?" "Sure, Mama," young Jim said. This would give him a chance to slip away for a couple hours and walk Annie Sue home after school. Jim was 14 now, and he and Annie Sue had been in the same class since grade 1. She didn't like him at first because he sat right behind her in school and would always pull her pigtails. When she found out he did this because he liked her, then she didn't mind. After breakfast, young Jim and Will grabbed their lunches and headed to school. On the way, they were joined by Matthew Walls and his young sisters, the twins, Sarah and Martha. "You going over to Annie Sue's after school?" Matthew asked young Jim. "Yes, I have to drop Will off at my sister's house first." They arrived at the little log schoolhouse just as Mrs. Kerr came out on the porch and started ringing the bell. Inside the school there was one big room with 8 rows of desks, one for each grade. Will held tightly to his brother Jim's leg while the other kids ran to the row of desks where their seat was. Matthew went to the grade 8 row while the twins went to the grade 3 row. Mrs. Kerr came over and knelt down in front of Will. "I remember when you were born, William. That was a very special day. Come with me to the grade 1 row so I can introduce you to the other grade 1 students." Will reached out slowly and let Mrs. Kerr take his hand, leading him to the grade 1 side of the room. "Emily, Sophie, Ashley, I would like you to meet our other grade 1 student, William Perry." William just looked at the girl shyly and barely nodded his head. "Hi, William," the girls said one after the other, smiling at him. Mrs. Kerr turned to the rest of the students. "Everyone, you've all met the other grade 1 students. This is William Perry. He's young Jim and Mrs. Margaret Anderson's younger brother. You know Mrs. Anderson, who helps me with you children when she's not too busy at home with her babies and working on the farm." Will was then led to his seat right behind the little girl named Sophie. At the beginning of every school day, Mrs. Kerr would always have all the students stand up and sing "God Save the Queen" in honor of Queen Victoria of England. "God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen, God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us, God save the Queen." Will and the rest of the grade 1 students stared at the other kids singing. Even his brother young Jim knew all the words. Annie Sue still sat right in front of Jim, just like she did since grade 1, and they looked at each other as they sang. Will looked at Sophie in front of him just as she turned around and stuck her tongue out. Girls. I don't know why Jim likes them. They're silly, Will thought. After the children finished singing, everyone sat down and pulled their books out from under their desks. All right, the rest of you grades know how we do this, Mrs. Kerr said. I start with the grade 1s, teach them some work, then I go in front of the grade 2s, and then each grade until grade 8. Then I go back to grade 1 to correct their work and do the same for the rest of the grades. Today I'm going to spend a little more time with the grade 1s, so the rest of you quietly work on your own. Grades 2, 3, and 4, get out your readers because I want you to read. Grades 5 and 6, you would do some writing, so you would need your writing pads. And grades 7 and 8, take out your textbook and work on your arithmetic. Now then, Mrs. Kerr said as she turned to the grade 1s, let's go in the back and sit in a circle and talk. The 4 children followed Mrs. Kerr and sat down, with Will sitting close to her right side. Mrs. Kerr turned to her left and asked, "What would you like to be when you grow up, Ashley?" Ashley was the smaller of the grade 1s. She had shoulder-length red hair that turned up on the ends, and she had a sprinkling of freckles on her nose. I'm going to be a mother with lots and lots of kids when I grow up. I'm going to hug and kiss them and rock them to sleep, just like I do my little sister Carolyn and my baby brother T. Frank. We call him T. Frank because he's so tiny. Mrs. Kerr smiled. That's very nice, Ashley. I know you will be the best mother there is. That's for sure, Mrs. Kerr. What are you going to do after you finish school, Sophie? Mrs. Kerr asked. Sophie had dark black hair that was almost to her knees. Her skin was a beautiful olive color, and you could see instantly she was of French descent. She had a delicate nose, and her lips were full and red. Sophie's father was Dr. Clare, who had helped Mrs. Kerr and Aunt Lynetta with the birth of Will. He was also the doctor for most of the other children in the school. I'm going to be a doctor, just like my father. I want to go to poor countries and help people that need help, Sophie said proudly. You can't be no doctor, Will spoke up. You're a girl. You should be like Ashley and have lots of kids. I can too, Sophie shouted. Cannot, Will shouted back. My daddy said there are plenty of girl doctors, and he says I'm as smart as any boy. Sophie was an only child. Her parents had her when they were older, but she wasn't spoiled. They raised her, however, to be a confident little girl. Now, children, Mrs. Kerr interrupted, be nice to each other. Sophie, I think that's a great idea. All of your patients will be lucky to have a caring doctor like you. Emily stood up in the middle of the circle and said, I want to be a teacher, Miss Kerr, just like you, so I can boss all the other kids around. Emily had short blonde hair and the bluest eyes you ever saw. Mrs. Kerr gently put her arm around Emily's waist. You know, Emily, it's easier to get others to do things if you ask them rather than tell them. Nobody likes it when people are mean. Do you like it when people boss you around? No, Mrs. Kerr, Emily said sheepishly as she lowered her head. Come on and sit down next to me so we can all find out what William wants to do when he gets big. Will had never told anyone what he wanted to do before. He thought of all the days he sat on his branch in the old oak tree in his front yard daydreaming of traveling around the world. He started to tell little Carl Baker one time until little Carl began laughing, saying anybody that leaves Elmstead Pew Settlement always comes back. So Will was very reluctant to share his private thoughts with people. He sat there looking at his hands, hoping Mrs. Kerr wouldn't ask him again. They all sat there waiting to see what Will would say. Finally he mumbled, I want to travel. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Kerr asked. We couldn't hear you. I want to travel, Will said a little louder. You want to travel? Mrs. Kerr leaned closer. Yes, ma'am. That sounds very exciting, William. Then you will really like the stories in my favorite book, The Adventures of Spike and Spencer. This is a book about Spike the dog and Spencer the cat, who tell the story about how they went all over the world meeting little children and their pets. How would you children like it if I read some of this book to you? Yay! all four of the grade 1 students said together. Mrs. Kerr reached behind her and pulled a bright red book off of the bookshelf. On the cover of the book was a dog and a cat floating in the clouds. She began to read. While playing one day, we thought it would be fun to share our adventure, so we asked our parents if they could help. We told them that we wanted to let other pets and pet owners know how the love and respect in our family has made us very happy. Writing this book together turned out to be a lot of fun. Later in the morning, Mrs. Kerr announced, "Recess, children. Everyone can go outside and play now. Remember what Spike the dog and Spencer the cat say when you're outside playing." "We will, Mrs. Kerr," the children said. "Be a friend, not a bully," Emily piped up. "Spike and Spencer say, be a friend, not a bully." The children ran for the door, gently pushing and shoving, trying to be the first one out. When Will came outside, little Carl Baker was at the bottom of the steps with two other boys in his grade 6 class, a short, chubby little boy and a taller, skinny one. "Come on, Will, and play King of the Hill with us," little Carl said. The shorter boy turned to little Carl. "He's too little to be King of the Hill." "I'm big enough," Will said, crossing his arms and sticking out his chest to try to make himself look taller. "He is a pretty tough guy," little Carl said. "I was there when he was born, and all the grown folks said this baby is a strong little fella." "Okay," the boy said, as the four turned and headed to one of the far corners of the schoolyard where there was a big pile of dirt. When they were running past the new grade 1 girls playing on the swings, Sophie stuck her tongue out at Will. Little Carl saw this and playfully punched Will on the arm. "Guess what, guys? Will Perry has a girlfriend." "Do not!" Will protested as he tried to hit back at little Carl. When he swung, he missed, spun in a circle, and fell. Emily, Ashley, and Sophie started laughing and pointing at Will. Will picked himself up with as much dignity as possible, stuck his tongue out at the girls, and ran after little Carl and the other boys, yelling as he went. Little Carl got to the top of the hill first, and was laughing at Will so hard he fell on the ground. Will caught up to little Carl and rode him to the bottom of the hill, then ran back to the top and began jumping up and down, shouting, "I'm King of the Hill! I'm King of the Hill!" All four of the boys laughed and laughed. They continued playing the rest of the recess, taking turns becoming King of the Hill. Will's first day of school flew by. When all the children began heading home for the day, Will couldn't stop talking about the fun he had. Except for Sophie Claire sticking her tongue out at him all the time, it was a perfect day. Young Jim, Matthew, and Annie Sue walked along talking as Will and the twins, Mary and Sarah, ran ahead playing tag and running around the trees. The Perry and Walsh children would always go behind Mr. Stowe's farmhouse to take a shortcut home. Mr. Stowe has a stone bridge that crosses the Puce River, and on each side of the bridge he put a large log. These logs are there so the wagon and horses won't fall off as they go to the fields at the back of his property. Matthew jumped up on a log on one side of the bridge, and young Jim jumped on the log on the other side, and they started tightrope walking across. The girls walked between the two boys on the bridge. Will climbed on the log behind his brother Jim and began carefully making his way across the slippery log. When he got to the middle of the river, he raised his arms and yelled out to the other children at the top of his voice, "Hey, look at me! I'm King of the Hill!" Just as he was saying that, Will's right foot slipped from under him and he tumbled into the Puce River. The river was higher than usual as a result of the past 3 days of rain. Young Jim saw his brother hit the water and without thinking dove in after him. Matthew, seeing what was happening, jumped off his log and ran across to the other side of the bridge. He could see the current carrying Will swiftly down the river, his head bobbing up and down below the surface. Young Jim was frantically swimming as fast as he could, trying to reach his little brother. The girls were jumping up and down on the bridge, screaming. "Go get some help," Matthew yelled to the girls as he ran along the bank, grabbing a broken tree branch lying on the side as he went. Mary and Sarah ran one way to their parents, John Freeman and Jane King Walls' home, and Annie Sue went the other towards Margaret and Fred Anderson's farm. Matthew continued running along the river bank, jumping tree stumps and other debris as he ran. He came up beside young Jim, who had just grabbed Will as he was about to go under the water for the third time. "Grab the branch, Jim. I'll pull you up," Matthew shouted. Young Jim reached out with his free hand while he held on desperately to Will with his other. The water current was very strong, but Jim was determined not to let go of his baby brother. Matthew sat on the creek bank, leaned back, and pulled as hard as he could. Slowly, the two children in the creek came to the side. When they got close enough, Matthew reached forward, grabbed young Jim's hand, and pulled with all his might. All three boys collapsed on the bank. Will was coughing and spitting out water. Young Jim was laying face down, breathing heavily through his mouth and nose. He reached over to his now crying brother and pulled him close to his side. Matthew was sitting beside them, shaking and in mild shock. That was the way the grown-ups found them. John Freeman Walls and Fred Anderson slid down the bank to the three boys. "Are you all right? What happened?" John asked his son Matthew. "Will fell in the river and young Jim jumped in after to save him. I was able to use that tree branch lying over there to pull the two of them to shore," Matthew answered. "Good thinking, Matthew," Fred said. "Come on, boys. Let's get you back to the house so we can dry you off and get some warm milk," John Freeman said. Jane King, Margaret, Annie Sue, the twins Martha and Sarah stood on the top of the bank as the others climbed back up. "Jane, soon as we get these kids dry, I will hitch up the team of horses to the wagon and take Will and young Jim home to Kazar and their father." "I'm going with you, John Freeman. Kazar may need some female comforting. You know how she feels about her boys," Jane insisted. So off this group went, heading to the Walls log cabin located up on the hill, while the twins, Sarah and Martha, ran ahead and started to play another game of tag.